But I wanted to get Christopher Leonard in here. He has written a brilliant new book. It's called Kochland, K-O-C-H land, as in, the Koch brothers, now mostly Charles Koch. The subtitle is The Secret History of Koch Industries and Corporate Power in America. Christopher Leonard, by the way, his website, christopherleonard.biz, B-I-Z, and you can tweet him at @CLeonardNews. Christopher Leonard, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me here. I appreciate it.
It is an absolutely brilliant book. I read part of it for our book review that we play before during the breaks. And boy, some really serious in-depth reporting. Let's just start with the large frame. And I thought, one of the fascinating things about this is just, how you start out with a story of, these venture capitalists going to Charles Koch or Charles and David Koch and saying, hey, we'd like to buy your company, or we'd like to take your company public, basically. So,
yeah.
And the Koch's saying, no, we got a better idea.
That's right. And I mean, that was the beginning of the story. And as you said when you read it, that was conventional wisdom at the time, that you should take a company public. But Charles Koch knew that in doing so, he would surrender control to a large degree in the company. And so he refused to do it. And that was a pattern you see again and again over the decades, is that he has this very developed vision of how the company ought to run and, frankly, how the world ought to work. And he sticks to it and really fights for it.
Yeah, the sense that I got reading your book was that Charles in particular, David kind of going along with it, and now David's pretty much out of the picture, so it's pretty much just Charles's show, that he actually is a true believer, that he's not just another greedy businessman who's saying, me, mine, more. I mean, there may be a component of that, but that he has bought into this philosophy that was, largely promoted back in the 50s, I think it was, the fee, the real estate lobby that invented the Libertarian Party as a way to promote, pro-business, what they call pro-business versus functionally pro-democracy ideas. And that Charles has completely bought into this stuff.
Absolutely. And let's back up. I mean, Charles Koch was raised in Wichita, Kansas by a wealthy industrialist named Fred Koch. And Fred Koch had 4 sons. Charles Koch was one of them. Fred Koch was one of the co-founders of the John Birch Society, as you know, one of the most secretive, paranoid, anti-government groups in modern conservative history. So those are the kind of political ideas that Charles Koch heard at the dinner table growing up. But Charles Koch added to that with the kind of libertarian philosophy that you just mentioned. And Charles Koch says he's really influenced by these Austrian economists like Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek. And the basic argument he takes from them is that any kind of government program, any kind of government intervention in the marketplace is only going to cause more harm than good. It'll create more problems than it solves. And the only real way you can structure society is as a voluntary free market exchange. And, you use the word ideologue, I think, and I would throw in the word engineer. Charles Koch is an engineer, and he thinks that these ideas truly are the blueprint for a society, and you can't argue with the blueprint. You can't change it based on your desires. You have to obey the laws of physics. And Charles Koch, I think, holds on to his view of the world with the exact same sort of, tenacity that an architect would hold to their blueprint.
I had Stephen Moore on this program a while ago, and the guy that Trump wanted to put on the Fed, and I said, what's more important, capitalism or democracy? At the point at which they come into conflict with each other, and he said, capitalism always. Now his philosophy, and he said it, and I'll echo what he said, just so it's in context. He said that without capitalism, in other words, without a robust, healthy economy, which he thinks capitalism produces, you can't have democracy. And, there is something to that argument, although, capitalism is sort of like football. If you wanted to play football and the NFL was to say, well, we're just going to stop enforcing the rules, or we're going to eliminate the rules, in fact. Whichever team has the most money and can hire the most players, they can have as many players on the field as they want. They can have they don't have to run, just 10 yards to make a first down. They can run 3 yards. And, and that seems to me like, what the Charles Koch category of libertarian ideologues are really advocating for, which is we don't even want there to be rules for the game of capitalism. We want to own the game of capitalism.
Yeah, and a big part of this book, Kochland, is the economic history of the United States since 1967, but even before that. And I think that the history shows that Stephen Moore has it exactly backwards. The fact is, you can't have capitalism without democracy.
Exactly.
Stephen Moore wanted to work for the administration of Donald Trump, I believe, right? And
Yeah.
Donald Trump uses this rhetoric of make America great again. I think when most people think of America's economic greatness, they think back to a period between, let's say, 1955 and 1970. Do you think that's fair in there somewhere?
Yeah.
That was a period of American history defined by the so-called New Deal, the package of laws and regulations and administrative bodies created under Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1930s.
Which are actually more progressive than anything Bernie Sanders has proposed. I mean, let's be clear about that.
No question. And the central theory of the New Deal, which broke up monopolies, regulated the financiers on Wall Street, and critically empowered labor unions. We can't forget that part of the story. The central philosophy of the New Deal was that democratic institutions need to constrain the worst impulses of capitalism. And when we lived under that system, prosperity was more widely spread in America than it has been at any point since or any point before.
Correct.
So this notion that democracy or democratic institutions somehow hinders capitalism, I think, is totally contrary to the historical record.
And you point out in the book that one of the first things that Charles Koch did was, or one of his first kind of major struggles was destroying his own unions.
That's exactly right. This was 1972 when labor unions were at their peak of power. I'm 44 years old. I kind of came of age in the economy of the 1990s, the 2000s, and just realized how ignorant I really was about what labor unions were and what working life was like back in the early 1970s when unions were at their peak of power. About 33% of the U.S. labor force was in a labor union. That affected every worker because all employers were worried that their workshop might unionize.
Yeah, so the theme back then was basically for every union worker, there was somebody who was a non-union worker who had functionally the identical benefit package because non-unionized employers had to compete with unionized employers.
It had an effect on everybody.
Yeah.
But Charles Koch, as an owner of his business, did not want to share control with the labor union at the refinery Koch owns in Minnesota, its most important asset, frankly. There was a question of control because the union would set the workplace rules, but also there was this question of efficiency. The union did make things less efficient, but you look at the alternative to that today, when unions represent about 7% of the workforce, and you look at what working conditions are like at Koch factories today, perhaps they're more efficient. They're certainly miserable for workers. They're more dangerous for workers, as Koch's own internal data shows. And workers are making less money today than they made 20 years ago in many cases.
Yeah. So we're talking with Christopher Leonard. He's the business reporter whose work has appeared in the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Fortune, Bloomberg, author of 2 books, The Meat Racket, now Kochland, The Secret History of Koch Industries and Corporate Power in America. And Christopher, we have about a minute and a half before we're going to hit a hard break here. As the take-home message from your book, is there any? Are you suggesting any specific policy prescriptions? Is there something? I mean, do we have like a cancer growing in our body, politic or economic, that has to do with the Kochs that should be responded to, or is this more just here's what happened?
It's a lot of here's what happened, but that illuminates this big picture debate. Do governments have a role to play in markets, or do they not? Right. And you look at the history and see what happens when they step aside.